Welcome to Hope is Here. My name is Greg Horn. Want to talk to you today about feeding the 5,000. We've been looking at a series called The Miracles of Jesus the last couple weeks. The first week we looked at the first miracle that Jesus ever did when he turned the water into wine at wedding, therefore setting the clock to start ticking for his walk to the cross where he was crucified in a just horrific death. And thankfully, as we get ready to celebrate here at Easter, the tomb was empty and hope was alive, but just so significant that when he did that first miracle, that clock started ticking. Then last week we looked at how Jesus provides peace in the storms of life. So if you missed those programs, I hope you'll go check those out. They were on Monday and Tuesday the previous 2 weeks. Go to our website, hopeisheretoday.org. That's hopeisheretoday.org. But today I want to look at the one of feeding the 5,000. Just an incredible story. And, out of all the miracles that Jesus did, there's only two of them that are in all four of the Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. This one, about Jesus feeding the 5,000, then the second one is the resurrection. And so I'm so thankful that we have four eyewitness accounts that we can look to that tell about this story and the resurrection. And, one of the things that I hope today is kind of a theme for you, both with Monday's program and tomorrow on Tuesday, is that never judge a problem in light of your own resources. I want to say that again. As a follower of Jesus, you don't have to. You should never judge your problem in the light of your own resources. And while I was putting these talks together, it just really was so strong in my heart, thinking about all the miracles God has done in my life. Yet the enemy's really, really good about us forgetting those, isn't he? I love this quote by Aaron Metaxas. He said, miracles seem to attest to the presence of a loving and compassionate God, one who wants to help us, who wants to speak to us and encourage us. David Wilkerson says, how quickly we forget God's great deliverances in our lives. How easily we take for granted the miracles that he performed in the past. And, maybe start reflecting on some of the miracles God's done in my past. This one here, my goodness, it's a miracle I'm here today. When I was in high school, a friend and I were driving a van with our high school football statisticians up to a game in northern Kentucky. And we went to Tates Creek and we were playing Boone County. And so we're driving the Interstate 75 North. My friend's like, man, I'm really tired. Why don't we switch drivers? You can drive. Would you drive? I said, sure. Well, instead of pulling over on the side of the road, putting it park and doing it, he said, man, I think we can set the cruise control and we can do it here with us, while we're driving. And being young and naive, both of us were skinny guys back then, and he still is, and me not so much. But we went to attempt, and everything was going well until he got his left leg out and he hit the steering wheel, and we started heading into the median, driving probably 60 miles an hour or something. And so thankfully I was able to correct it, but man, it was scary as we were fishtailing down the interstate. Thankfully there was no other cars around us at that time. It was just a miracle that nothing happened, but during that time I could hear one of the young ladies that was in the back, hear her head just bumping in the back there as we were fishtailing down the interstate. So obviously we all breathed a sigh of relief. We got to the game, probably 25, 30 minutes later. And then after the game was over, guess what? None of those football statisticians, I think there were 6 of them, would ride home with us. And obviously don't blame them. But, I'd forgotten about that story as a 17-year-old kid. You think you're invincible, but just, it was stupid. Oh, my goodness. But thankfully, God, just in his grace, it was a miracle that we're still alive. And yet, I want you today to maybe reflect on something you did like we did. It was really unwise, okay? And yet, you're still here today. And, we all just we need to be reminded of the miracles that God has done in our life, something like that, or with a financial situation, or how he provided a job just out of nowhere. I recently had lunch with a guy that I met for the first time, and he was just sharing with me about how God provided this job that brought him to Lexington. And it was an incredible story how only God could have done it. He said, I know I can't take any credit for it, but he said, I'd had a conversation earlier this morning with a friend. He lived out in Oklahoma at the time, and just said he felt like God might be doing something new. And he said, to be honest, he goes, I feel like we need to get back to the eastern part of the state, maybe somewhere in Kentucky where my wife's from, or Pennsylvania where I'm from, and somewhere in between. And then literally like a few hours later, the guy he had the conversation with, his friend, was contacted by somebody about looking for somebody for a job in Lexington. Wanted to know if he knew anybody. He's like, yeah, I got a guy that actually would be perfect for that. And 15 years later, it's history. The guy's here in Kentucky. And so just one of those miracles that God provides. If you've got your Bible, we're going to be hanging out looking at John chapter 6, verses 1 through 15. And it says, sometime after this, Jesus crossed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee, and a great crowd of people followed him because they saw the signs he had performed by healing the sick. Then Jesus went up on a mountainside and sat down with his disciples. The Jewish Passover festival was near. When Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming toward him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" Jesus asked this only to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. Philip answered him, "It would take more than a half of year's wages to buy enough bread for each one to have a bite." Another of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. "Here is a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish, but how far will it go amongst so many?" Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." There was plenty of grass in that place, and they sat down. About 5,000 men were there. Jesus then took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. He then did the same with the fish. When they all had enough to eat, Jesus said to his disciples, "Gather the pieces that are left over. Let nothing be wasted." So they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. After the people saw the sign Jesus performed, they began to say, "Surely this is the prophet who has come into the world." Jesus, knowing what they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to a mountain by himself. Wow, just a lot of good takeaways from this story in John chapter 1, verses 1 through 15. And I want to share 10 things starting today. Obviously, we're not going to get through the whole list. That as I was reading this passage, I've never shared on this one before, done a Hope is Here program that I can remember of in the 7 years, but just some things that God spoke to me through reading this passage. And the first thing is that, often following Jesus sometimes involves a test. I'm basing this off verses 5 and 6 in John chapter 1. It says, when Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming toward him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" Jesus asked this only to test Philip, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. And so, friends, a lot of times we don't really know what's going on, but sometimes Jesus wants to see, hey, where are we at? Where are we in our faith? Do we really trust him? And one of the things that comes to this from me, I love this quote by Justin Miller. He said, "The one asking the question is the answer to the question." That's Jesus, okay? Jesus asked him, hey, where shall we buy bread for all these people to eat? Well, Jesus knew he's going to wind up using the little boy with the 5 loaves and the 2 fishes, but he wanted to see, how Philip would respond. And, Jesus was the answer. Instead of just looking to Jesus and asking him to provide, Philip didn't do that. And so I got to ask you today, where are you looking for the answer to the questions that you have going on in your life? Are you looking towards Jesus? I know I've been guilty of looking in, my job and my financial resources and a spouse and friends. I mean, there's a lot of things that we substitute that we could put in the place there of Jesus. And man, it's just a great reminder today to put Jesus first. And just know that he wants to be the answer and he will help you find the solution. Quite often he lets us be a part of that and other people to help answer questions, but it all starts with looking towards Jesus. I want to encourage you to do that today. Second takeaway I think we can learn from this story in John chapter 1, verses 1 through 15. How do you respond during the test? How do you respond during the test? You know, miracles always start with a mess. I mean, obviously, you know, Jesus asked Philip that question, and then Andrew, he piped up and said, you know, hey, Philip said, you know, it would take more than half a year's wages to buy enough bread for each one to eat. You know, so Philip, God knew how he's going to do it, but when he asked Philip that earlier question we just looked at, Philip answered, it would take more than a half year's wages to buy enough bread for each one to have to eat. Well, I want to remind you, friends, that miracles always start with a mess. Miracles always start with a mess. You know, don't like to admit that, but it's just true, friends. You know, we all, I think, want to have a message to share with people about how Jesus worked in our life. Well, it always starts with a mess, doesn't it? Or a lot of say, man, I wish I had a cool testimony to share with others. Well, anybody has a testimony had to go through a test, right? And so I want to encourage you today to really look to Jesus and when you have to respond during a test. A third thing that we can take away from Jesus feeding the 5,000 is sometimes we're like Andrew. We're our own worst enemy in how we respond to Jesus in situations. In verses 8 and 9, after he asked Philip the question about how are we going to feed these people, and Philip responded about it'll take more than a half a year's wages to buy enough bread for each one to have a bite. Then that's when Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. In verse 9, he said, here is a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish. So he's getting on the solution side, but then in the next breath he says, but how far will they go among so many? How far will they go among so many? You know, it's kind of one of those things, friends, if we're honest, we're either a person that the glass is half full or a person that the glass is half empty. And that's really, really a big thing. I want to ask you right now, how are you looking at your circumstances? Are you looking at, we don't have all we need yet, but man, I'm thankful for what God has provided so far. Because friends, that can be a game changer. And we really, really need to know that we can trust God and we can see God. And he wants to. But a lot of it starts with us. The Bible says life and death is in the tongue. And we need to be really wise and careful, friends, about the words that we say and speak words of life and hope, faith. And it's a game changer. And one of the things I know is when I get tired and when I get fatigued, I don't look at the glass as half full as often as I should. I start to look at it as half empty. And I'm thankful that I have family and friends that will kind of, say, hey, Greg, I don't know if you're aware of this, but you're kind of being negative. You're kind of being critical. And quite often it happens when I'm fatigued, friends. I'm not getting enough rest and I'm just doing too much. And, it's really hard sometimes because being in ministry, pastor of a church, Gardenside Christian Church in Lexington, and executive director of Hope is Here Ministry, there's always ministry things to do. And I love doing them and God's called me to do them. But sometimes when I get fatigued, I don't respond well to questions and to thoughts. And I look at the glass as being half empty instead of half full. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time, but I hope you'll join us again tomorrow as we'll continue looking at 10 things we can learn from Jesus feeding the 5,000 on Hope is Here.